Hey everybody, it is Gordon Majak here, back with another episode of Timeless Pop, Rock, and Soul, and back with about take 10 of trying to nail this video, because it seems that over the last several minutes here, as I've been trying to record this video, I have had one hell of a difficult time describing exactly what this artist means to me. Because it's pretty deep and it's pretty profound. So let me try again. We are going to be talking about an artist here that is not only one of my all-time top 10 artists, easy top 10, but this is an artist that I think more so than any other musician I have ever heard in my lifetime, any other music that I have ever listened to in my lifetime. This is an artist with whom I feel an incredible spiritual connection as well. And the final layer I'll put on it is that I will say, with the possible exception of Bob Dylan, there is not one single musical artist that I have ever heard in my lifetime that I have more admiration and respect for than this one. This is an artist that truly, I can say, looking back now all these years later, has been a life changer for me, not only musically, but certainly on my spiritual journey as well. Pretty deep stuff right there, right? Well, that can only mean one thing. If it's not Bob Dylan, who else could it be, right? How about the great Van Morrison? We are going to go back to 1983 for this one. This is Van Morrison's album, Inarticulate Speech of the Heart. What an iconic cover. I'll never forget. I'll tell you guys here really quick the story of how I discovered this record. But we're going to go back to 1983. Inarticulate Speech of the Heart is the album by Van Morrison. We're going to hear a song called Higher Than the World. Now, let me set the picture for you here. This album came out here in March of 1983. And that is exactly the month I started my then new job at AEI Music in Seattle as a music programmer. I had been in the Seattle club music scene, playing in the discos there for a while for the previous few years. And then when I got sick of that and needed to change, I jumped over to the recording studio scene at AEI, and I started there exactly in March of 1983, and that's when this album was released. And I can remember this clear as day. I was a brand new music programmer there at AEI, and I was working the night shift. They put me on the night shift all by myself. And they put me in the little audition studio. I didn't even merit my own recording studio at that point. I was in the smallest little audition studio we had, a tiny little room the size of a closet, literally. And there was room for nothing in that little room except the desk that had two turntables, two nice Technics turntables, a little 4-channel mixer, an equalizer, and a couple JBL monitors. And there was room for a bookshelf over in the corner where they put all the new albums and all the new product that was coming in, all the new music. And so I started there on the night shift, March of 1983, and it was one of my very first nights on the job where I was sitting there and just auditioning some material and learning some new music. And I noticed that there was a brand new album up on the shelf, Van Morrison, Inarticulate Speech of the Heart. And as I said, I had been a big Van Morrison fan going all the way back there. I loved his oldies in the 60s, Brown Eyed Girl and Gloria. I was way into that Moondance album there in the early 70s. It came out in 1970, and by the early 70s, mid 70s, I was way into that Moondance record. And so I was a fan of Van Morrison even way back then in the 70s. But what I was not was necessarily super knowledgeable in terms of knowing all of his albums and all of his songs and everything about Van Morrison. I knew him as a musical artist that I liked, and I had a connection to him in that sense musically, but that was more or less the extent of it. It didn't really go any farther than that. So there I was in 1983, just started at AEI, and I see this record up on the shelf. And first of all, my first impression was, wow, that is one hell of a cool album cover. Whoever designed that deserves an award. That's just genius with the musical staff and the hearts and yeah, that's just so cool. And I thought, okay, well, I haven't really checked out Van Morrison for a few years. This is 1983, and I probably hadn't really been all that familiar with anything Van Morrison had done since his Wavelength album going back to 1978. Because after that, I was in the club scene, and I was going off in a whole different direction musically. And I still listen to pop and rock, of course, but I didn't really keep up on it quite as much as I would have in my younger days and in my later days, because when I was in the club scene, I really had to be on top of all the club music. So Van Morrison was one of those artists that for a few years there, I'd sort of gotten away from and hadn't really paid much attention to what he was doing. So I pulled out this album in March of 1983, put it on the turntable, and queued up the first song. And I will tell you, no exaggeration, this was a life changer. And I don't even know how to describe how profound it was at the time, but I'll bet that I played this song probably 3 or 4 times in a row, that very first time that I queued it up. I was just that touched by it. And I don't know how it happened. I don't know why it happened. It just came out of nowhere. But Van Morrison somehow came full circle in my life there in 1983. And I was never the same after that. And the only way I can describe it is this was a musician, as I said, that I already knew and liked, but all of a sudden there was a deeper connection to Van Morrison. And that came through in the nature of his lyrics and his music, and this just spiritual side. I knew about Van Morrison, the artist, and I knew those other albums and those other songs, and I knew of Van Morrison's spiritual side in his music, but I had not personally connected to that side of him yet. I just knew about it. I heard about it. Oh, he's this crazy Irish mystic guy, right? That's what some of the people used to say about him back in the day, that he was kind of like a mystic, right? Well, from one mystic to the other, what do you know? So I popped this album on, and there it was. And just to jump ahead a little bit, so this is 1983, and I will say that they're starting with this record, and then through the rest of the 80s and well into the 1990s, I mean, Van Morrison was just like my personal musical guru. I was so very deep into his albums and all of his songs and his lyrics. And I really felt like Van Morrison was just a kindred spirit for me for everything that I was going through on my own spiritual journey. I felt like there was a song and he was talking about these things in his songs. And I could just go down the list. So many albums of Van Morrison's in the 80s and the 90s that were just life-changing records for me that I just would listen to for months and months on end. And it all started with this song. So I want to take you guys back to the very beginning of my spiritual relationship with Van Morrison. This is where it began, a song called Higher Than the World. And I was never the same, sitting there in my little studio that night, and I put the needle on this, and oh my goodness. just a little bit higher than the world, Van Morrison. Now, you're probably thinking, and I'm feeling it myself too, like I said, this is about the 10th take I've done of this video, trying to put into words what Van Morrison has meant to me on my spiritual journey and the unique influence that he's had on me spiritually through his music. And I'm telling you, I'm sitting here and I'm just grasping at words, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure I can do it. I'm not sure I can explain how deeply I have felt and how deeply I've been moved spiritually by so many of these incredible Van Morrison songs. And of course, now when I discovered this one back there in 1983, and as I said before, I was aware of that reputation that Van Morrison had of being sort of this transcendent vocalist and transcendent artist, right? Who could occasionally just sort of go off into the universe and take you with him, right? I knew about that. I heard about it, but I had not experienced it for myself until this record. Now, of course, once I did experience it for myself, then I went back into his catalog, all the way back there to Astral Weeks, of course, and I heard Moondance in a different light as well. And as I worked my way up through Van Morrison's catalog, of course, there were all those many nuggets of spiritual and transcendence, enlightenment, take your pick, the subject matter, but all the real juicy, deep stuff, all the philosophical stuff. And I got familiar with all of that stuff. And then, as I said, going forward is when it just really got crazy for me with Van Morrison into the 80s and into the 90s. He ran off a string of records, I would say starting in 1986. Well, it started with this song for me in 1983, but album-wise, 1986, his record, No Guru, No Method, No Teacher. Oh my God, that was a life changer. The next record, Poetic Champions Compose, I think that was 1987. Another life changer. Just so many great spiritual messages in his music, spiritual thoughts, spiritual ideals, philosophical thoughts, the whole journey, the whole spiritual journey. I've never seen another artist, never heard another artist. I don't know, maybe it's because they're not on that journey. Who knows? I have no idea. But I've never heard another artist to put it so beautifully and so eloquently and so personally and so intimately. That's the only way I know how to explain it. I'm just sitting here grasping at words. And I was so looking forward to doing this video because I couldn't wait to share this song in this whole aspect of the Van Morrison thing with you guys. But then, of course, as soon as I turn on the camera, I'm just completely befuddled and I can't even talk about it. How bizarre is that? It's just so difficult to put into words something that is such a uniquely spiritual and personal experience, right? Maybe that's what it comes down to. How do you describe the indescribable, right? And isn't that such a big part of the spiritual journey? The ineffable, right? We keep chasing the ineffable. I have to go think about that one. Hope you guys enjoy Van Morrison on a Monday afternoon. I could do a whole week of Van Morrison. No joke. I know you guys aren't way into Van Morrison like I am too. Totally understand. That's why I tend to focus on so many of these other artists. But yeah, if it was up to me, man, you might get a whole week of Van Morrison. I'll take you on a spiritual journey. You want to hear some of this stuff? It's just unbelievable. It's all there, waiting for you to discover it. See you tomorrow, folks. Hope you enjoyed Van Morrison. I did such a lousy job of describing it. Just listen to the music. Forget about me. Just listen to this incredible music.